This is the final part of assignment 4.3, and now we move on to quantitative data. So first of all, what is quantitative data? Well, it's used to quantify a problem by generating numerical data into usable statistics, and it's used to quantify different kinds of behaviours, attitudes, and opinions. It's also used to generalise results to a larger population, and it's recorded by different collection techniques such as surveys and questionnaires. So there are 4 different ways of collecting quantitative data, and these are by lab and field experiments, questionnaires, and observations. First of all, we'll look at lab experiments. So lab experiments are those in which research is conducted in highly controlled conditions, and the researcher manipulates the independent variable and records the effect of the dependent variable. Now, some pros of this experiment are that there is high control over extraneous variables. As all variables are well controlled, there will be an increase of internal validity. And secondly, the experiments can be replicable because the exact same setup can be used to redo the same experiment, unlike in a field experiment, but we'll come on to that next. And lastly, you get accurate and precise results due to the high quality equipment used in the lab. This will make them more valid and reliable. However, some disadvantages are that there is a lack of ecological validity and realism to the real world, as somebody may have behaved differently in an experiment if it was in a natural setting. Also, there could be social desirability from the participants, increasing the chance they'll change their behaviours just to please the researcher, which will affect the true results. Then finally, there's a risk of demand characteristics, as the participant is likely to figure out what the study's about and change their behaviour because of it. Then field experiments differ slightly from lab ones. The independent variable is still manipulated, and the effect of the dependent variable is still looked at and recorded, but this time it's in an everyday setting and therefore is more natural to the participant involved. Some pros to this experiment are that there is a higher ecological validity due to the experiment taking place in a natural setting. Also, they're cheap and accessible because, again, it's in the participant's natural environment. And finally, there will be less demand characteristics because their behaviour is likely to be more valid and authentic. And some cons are that there is less control over extraneous variables because it's not in a highly controlled environment. This would therefore lead to a lack of internal validity, making the experiment less replicable. Secondly, they're very time consuming, as you'd have to set up all of the equipment beforehand and then dismantle it at the end. And then finally, they could possibly be unethical due to the fact that sometimes participants don't know they're being observed, which makes it unethical as they didn't give their consent before the experiment, so they didn't know if they actually wanted to be filmed or not. Okay, so now we move on to questionnaires. These involve a preset list of questions or items to which the participant responds through written answers. They're used to assess a person's thoughts and experiences. Questionnaires could be used as part of an experiment to measure the dependent variable, and there are different styles of question they can use. So these could be open and closed questions. Now, some pros to this collection technique are they're simple, as once they're designed, they can be administered with little training, and the quantitative data collected is easy to analyse. Secondly, they're cheap and easy, which is pretty obvious and sort of a given. And lastly, there is less interpersonal influence because the researcher isn't present, and so there is a reduction in participant and researcher bias. And some cons are that there can be wording issues, so there could be technical language in there that the participant may not understand, therefore creating an ambiguous situation for them. Next, there could be social desirability, which I've spoken about before. They just basically write down answers that make them look good. And then finally, there isn't a chance for any follow-up questions, which means you can't get a deeper insight or you could even get a lack of numerical figures. The last collection technique we have is observations. So these are non-experimental methods and are usually when researchers observe behaviours and record them with no deliberate manipulation of any variables. They mostly take place in a natural setting. So an example relating back to the British under-18 female gymnasts, their natural setting would be in a gymnastics centre where they train and do competitions. For the last bit about collection techniques, we have the advantages and disadvantages of notational analysis observations. Some advantages are that you can make a video and then annotate it later on, rather than doing it as it happens, as you may miss a specific behaviour. Another advantage is that you can compare or show improvements due to the look back on how the video went, so you can actually get constructive criticism. And finally, they can value all contributions to performance. Then some disadvantages are that you may miss a behaviour, which links back to how you don't need to annotate the behaviours as they happen, because something like missing it might happen. Another con is that they may require multiple observers depending on the length of the observation and how many specific behaviours they're looking for. And lastly, observers would require more training in order to be able to watch the video and understand what they need to record. Okay, so now we move on to experimental designs. The first one is independent independent groups. This is a type of research design where there are two sets of participants, set A and set B. So set A takes part in condition 1 and set B takes part in condition 2. There are no swap overs, so one group only does one condition. An example would be if female gymnasts took part in an experiment where the researcher wanted to see if a drug had an effect on the girl's flexibility. The girls in condition 1 didn't have the drug and the girls in condition 2 did. The researcher would then test the effect of the drug by seeing how high their scores were in the sit and reach test, for example. The next design is repeated measures. In this design group, the participants involved are the same for both conditions, and the idea is all of them enter condition 1 and then go into condition 2. So relating back to the experiment on the last slide, there wouldn't be two sets of girls, there would only be one. This set will go into condition A and not take the drug, then in condition 2 they will have that drug. Just as independent groups, the researcher will test the effect of the drug on their flexibility. So this is the last bit of this video, and now we're on to the experimental design matched pairs. This involves two sets of participants, and each group are carefully matched on variables considered relevant to the experiment. So examples of variables they could be matched on are gender, age or IQ, etc. Each group takes part in both conditions, but at different times. So set A would go into condition 1 and then condition 2, whereas set B would go into condition 2 and then condition 1. And this design is actually called counterbalancing.